Carla Gutierrez's career has included The Last Out, Pray Away, Julia, and an Emmy nomination for RBG. She's here now to discuss her latest documentary from Amazon MGM Studios, Frida, giving viewers a raw and magical journey into the life of iconic artist Frida Kahlo. Carla, what inspired you to tell Frida's story, and how did you want to separate your film from other projects we've seen or read about Frida in the past?
So I feel like I've been carrying this story inside of me for a long time, since I got obsessed with Frida, as many young women do, when I was much younger. And I have, had a relationship with her paintings for a few decades, actually, feeling really close to her art and like finding refuge in her art. But it was really a few years ago when the idea popped into my head, and I went back to the books that I had read when I was young, that I saw that her voice was very present. She had left this, very rich testimony of her life, but it was all in written materials, in letters, in essays. There were hundreds of letters that she sent to her loved ones, a few print interviews. And that was what I felt could be a unique way of telling her story that I hadn't seen in film before, actually using her own voice and her own words to narrate the emotional experience of her life, and to really understand how her life was really so, connected to the art that she's left for us. Um, and so I decided to, this was the type of film that I wanted to hear, and to see about Frida, and I decided to just jump in and say, okay, I need to direct this because her voice hasn't been the center, the focus of a film before, her own words. And so that was the approach that we gave to the film.
And you've worked many years as an editor, so
Mhm.
you really felt passionately about this, where you wanted this to be the one you direct yourself.
Yeah, it was really this story that, this is pretty much the reason why I've become a director. It was the story that told me, like, you have the experience as an editor to know how to tell this story, and you feel so close to her. So why not? Like, I just felt like it was my story, the approach that we were giving, this film, that it was my approach to give to the audience.
And what's fascinating about it, as you mentioned, is it's in her own words. So we're
Mhm.
really seeing things directly from her. How long did that take? I mean, how much material did you actually have? And then how do you begin to sort of go through that and work with to say, okay, this goes in, this comes out, like, because I imagine it was a huge quantity of material.
So, most people that get to know about her life, read about her life, they only get fragments of, some of the letters, some of the things that she's written. So you get to know her just through some fragments of her own words. So my team actually ended up collecting all the writings that we, could have access to. And the writings are in different places. Not all of them have been published. So we really probably, have like the largest database that, we didn't find any other database of all of her writings. There was a lot of material that we had, like about 450, 500 letters that she wrote, to people. And and then really, what we really wanted to do was to capture, this woman's spirit, and not to present her as, to humanize her, not to only show her as kind of like the symbol that she's become. She's a symbol of woman empowerment. A lot of times people see her as a symbol of sexiness. You can see her face everywhere. But really to get the texture of her personality, and even learn about her fragility. Like, we didn't want to present like perfect woman, because none of us are perfect, but really kind of like the complexity. And it's her complexity, all the layers of this woman that she wanted to express through art, and she found her voice through art. So it was a process of, reading everything, really everything. Like, I think we ingested all of Frida, everything that she's left us, to make this film, and then really decide to lean into her emotions, to lean into her fragility, and also to lean into her humor. She was a very humorous, very strong spoken, like, she had a sharp tongue. So really present that aspects of her.
That's one of the things that struck me was her sharp tongue because this was a woman born in 1907. So
Mhm.
she seems very ahead of her time in terms of her sexuality, the way she speaks. I remember when there was a quote I loved that when she opened in Paris and she's like, these rich bitches don't want to buy anything. Men are kings in the art world. So how far ahead of her time did she feel and what was that struggle like for women of that era to be recognized as artists?
I mean, we didn't recognize them and we didn't recognize Frida until like about 20 years after her death. That's when people started discovering her. And I think that the reason why she's connected with so many people is that ultimately, and in our film, we really want to show that ultimately the story is about a woman that decides not to contain her voice. And, I would love to say that she was ahead of her time then, but now, it feels that she's even ahead of her time now, with everything that like women are dealing with. I mean, in our film, we go into, to struggles that she went through as she was, facing a pregnancy, maybe deciding to, maybe abort the pregnancy or to keep the baby. I mean, those are all things that like we as women deal with. She had a miscarriage. She, wanted to express her pleasure and desire, and I feel that even now we women don't really talk about these very personal, intimate things. So I hope that the film really connects to people now, because she still feels very much ahead of her time, and somebody that like, a woman that feels free to really express all of her emotions and to say what I'm feeling internally is as important, and the world that I'm interacting with. So yeah, she was definitely ahead of her time then, but she feels ahead of her time now.
Yeah. And the film is told with so much of her art as well. And
Mm.
you take it a step further and really embellish the visuals with animation. Who did you work with on the visual and how did you come up with that concept?
It was, it was a bold decision that we made from the beginning, because obviously we were gonna play a little bit with this iconic art, right? But we saw her paintings as part of her voice. We had her writings, we had her words, but the paintings are also very much kind of like a view into her internal world. And we wanted, for that paintings to come alive in a cinematic way and be part of the storytelling of the film. So we decided, really early on to animate. We never bring in elements that are outside of her paintings, but we give movement, and we highlight some of the emotions in her paintings through our animation. And we work with this amazing group that came together for a film of, led by two female animators in Mexico City. And our team was mostly female. And it was really important for me to also work with Latinx talent, and here in the United States, but also in Mexico. So all the animation happened down there. And yeah, I think that it is a strong way of bringing another aspect of her voice to life, but it's her visual voice.
And we really learned a lot about her relationship with Diego Rivera, which
Mhm,
they were married, divorced, remarried. She put conditions on their
mhm.
remarriage. I mean, they really butted heads quite a bit. But what ultimately do you think kept them together? Because they really just they couldn't stay away from each other no matter what the other tended to do to the other.
So it wasn't a perfect relationship. She
Um,
was in yeah, in his shadows for a long time. And again, that was kind of our goal. Like, we didn't want to show this perfect love story. Their love story was, it was very problematic. Sometimes it was very toxic. It was obsessive love. And at the same time, there was also a supportive partnership, and there was a lot of support and, and passion, desire, and love as well. And that's what we wanted to show. Like I think a lot of the responses that we've gotten from people that have watched the film is that, it is how we love, right? Relationships are complicated, and she wasn't perfect in dealing with that love. She wasn't a perfect person at all. But we wanted to show the electricity between them, the support between them, but at the same time, the problems that that they had. And there were problems.
There were
It was
problems.
an intense, it was a very intense, very volatile relationship. But they really truly love each other, and they were present in, all of their lives. They were very important to each other as well.
And you got a lot of his words as well. I mean,
Mhm.
was that part of her collection, or did you have to outsource those from Diego?
So the film is told entirely through first-person testimony. So it's mainly Frida's voice, but you also hear the voices from people that were present throughout her life. So Diego is a big part of that. You also hear from, some friends, from her first lover, from the nurse that took care of her at the end of her life. So this is all kind of like direct witnessing of her days here on earth, and her emotions. Um, with Diego, he wrote a couple of biographical, essays, and also a book. And so we took a lot from there. And there were some also interviews that he did where he talks about Frida. So we used, sometimes like interviews that people made, about Frida after Frida's death. We also used some essays that people wrote, of the time, and even diary entries of other people. So yeah, the collection, the research, and the collection of not only archival footage and archival pictures, but also the archival writings, were, immense in this film.
Well, it's beautiful to watch and
Thank
so
you.
informative. And Carla, thank you so much for joining Golderby's film documentary panel today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Irene Taylor's feature debut, Here and Now, won a Peabody Award and was followed by Beware the Slender Man, Moonlight Sonata, Deafness in Three Movements, and The Final Inch, which brought her an Oscar nomination. Irene, how did this documentary come to be, and how were you connected to Celine Dion?
Well, I did not know Celine before this film. In fact, I was a little bit surprised when someone contacted me, a producer contacted me who has worked closely with her and her management in the past. And she said she was thinking of me for this possible film that Celine was open to. But I was surprised because I have really, my films are very much character driven, but I'd never focused on someone with as much celebrity as Celine has. And so to be honest, I think I felt ill-equipped. But I did trust that I would be able to get to know her. And over the first several months, we just got to know each other before we decided to work together. And I think we were really trying to just see if there was not only a chemistry there, but I think Celine was really looking for someone she could tell her secret to. And that's really what the film is about, is this lie, this unfortunate lie that she had been telling the world for many years. So
And when you're working on a film like this, how difficult is it to balance, because you can get lost in her music for a whole documentary. You could make it just about that. So how did you focus and shift the balance to really show parts of her life and why she's such a huge star, but really hone in on her life and struggles?
well, I think I wanted to meet her where she was at when we were filming. And, we filmed essentially 2 years ago. And it would have been out of bounds just to do a straightforward biopic when her body was going through this tumultuous detox off of medications. She was trying to figure out what was happening with her vocal cords. And so she also was just at a time where she was at home with her children. And I think she was not used to having that kind of time. So it was very clear that the film needed to focus on this exceptional period of her life. And, you know, going back into her music and some of her performances, it wasn't just to take my viewers down memory lane. It was really to show the breadth of her career as a performer, because she really didn't quite know how to step outside of that role. She had been a performer ever since she was very young, performing at 5, 6, 7 years old with her family. So I really just tried to use the rest of her life as context, and also to brighten up the film a little bit, because I think what she was going through on a daily basis when I was with her, it was a struggle. It was a struggle, and I wanted the film to have some balance between the struggle and that essential talent and essential joyful person that I think Celine is at heart.
And there's no diva in this film. I mean, there's no makeup. She laid it all out there. Was anything off limits? And what was she like as a person for you to work with?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was very, as someone who doesn't wear much makeup myself, I was very happy when on day one, she just showed up with her hair in a ponytail like me, and she was very down to earth. I knew that there was going to be a bit of a step down of formality in the film from day one. That was very clear. And Celine is really exceedingly kind. I think that does come across in the film, but even when she was just like trying to take care of me in her home, she did, though, she had a little bit of a lion's roar at times. And one of them was when she said in the very beginning, "You are in my home. Do not ask me if you can film. You can film anything, and I will stop you if I don't like it." Well, she never stopped me. My director of photography, the first day was a little sheepish, but we both just took the bull by the horns, and he followed her into her bathroom, in her dressing room. He followed her to wherever she was going. And, we were really just a fly on the wall. And sometimes that led her to where her medications were. Sometimes it led her to her closet, to where her children were. There were only 2 or 3 moments in a year where I actually sat her down and said, "Let's have an interview." So we really just tried to create the film around a verite style. And I think that made us all feel more relaxed. So.
Well, there was one scene in particular I think shocked everyone, and that's when she has a seizure. It's heartbreaking to watch, but it's also very vulnerable to show. Did you talk to her about that scene in particular and showing that in the film?
Yeah. Well, that was a really unfortunate day for everyone. I think my director of photography and I realized Celine was having, we called it a medical episode, because in theory it appears like a stiffening seizure, but it's really her body just goes into this rigid stance, and we didn't know if she was breathing. We didn't know if she was conscious of what was happening. So her physical safety was paramount at first, but it only took us 30 seconds to realize there were 2 people in the room, her bodyguard and her physical therapist, who had a protocol given to them by doctors of exactly what to do if this were to happen. So we looked at each other, my DP and I, and we kept filming. And we decided to do that because Celine had told us, "Don't shy away. Always film, and I'll tell you to stop." And of course, I also know, as an experienced filmmaker, just because you shoot something doesn't mean we have to include it in the film. And I didn't know where this was headed. I was the sound person for most of the film over the course of the year. And that day, I even used my microphone to help those of us in the room know if she was breathing or not, because we couldn't hear her breath.
Wow.
So we did stick it out. It was painful for everyone involved. And Celine never asked me to see the footage. I did eventually show her the film. I would have never considered not showing her the film, you know, after that happened. And I showed her that scene within the context of the whole film. And I remember finding it curious at the time that she didn't say, may I just see the raw footage? And I think she really appreciated what we used of it. We didn't shy away from it. She said, do not cut it down. Don't cut it down. But she never asked to see the original footage. And I think it's really hard. I think it's really hard for her to see herself that way. But it is her truth. So.
And this happened after your documentary, but I'm just curious, what did you think when you saw her take center stage in Paris at the Olympics and make that performance?
Well, as it was happening, I was looking at my phone because people kept texting me that it was happening. I actually didn't see it live as it was happening. I was actually with my family at that moment. And so I actually went back and looked at it in retrospect. And what I really did see was her joy. I was actually quite surprised at the stamina and strength she had. And I felt reassured that while this illness she has, you know, it is very misunderstood, she's clearly able to balance some aspects of her life and her body enough that she could do that. And I know she really wanted to do it, but there was no conversation about that. I didn't know about it. It was not a previously cooked up idea, you know, that we would release the film and then a month later she'd be in Paris. I mean, wouldn't that be grand if we did? But that was not what happened. So
Well, it's such a great film, and there's also fun moments too. We get to see the storage facility of all of her clothes and talk about how she smashes herself into shoes. So she has a great sense of humor throughout as well. And I hope everyone gets a chance to see it. It's streaming right now. Irene, congratulations on this fantastic film, and thanks for being part of Gold Derby's film documentary panel today.
sure.
Emily Kassie is an Emmy and Peabody nominated filmmaker and investigative journalist. Her work for the New York Times, PBS, and Netflix ranges from the Taliban's crackdown on women to America's immigrant detention system. Today, she's here to talk about her National Geographic film, Sugarcane, an investigation into abuse and missing children at an Indian residential school in Canada, which sparked reckoning on the nearby Sugarcane Reserve. Emily, you co-directed this film with Julian Brave Noisecat, who is the son of one of the subjects of the film. How did that relationship form, and how did you decide to make this documentary?
Yeah, absolutely. First, thanks so much for having me. Julian and I met 10 years ago, almost a decade ago, at our first reporting jobs. We were randomly sat at the desks next to each other and became fast friends. In the years since, I kind of went on to become an investigative journalist and filmmaker, focusing on conflicts internationally and people caught in the crossfires from places like, the Saharan Desert, following traffickers and migrants to, corporate corruption in the United States, to the aftermath of the genocide in Rwanda, and always kind of looking at these questions of why are people persecuted? How do they survive? And a lot of that for me has to do with being brought up in a community of Holocaust survivors and their descendants. And so those questions were pretty formative for me. Julian, of course, went on to become an incredible writer and journalist focusing on Indigenous life in North America. And we kept trying to work together. We kept trying to find something that would bring our skill set together. And in May of 2021, I got the New York Times notification, as many people did, that there had been potential unmarked graves discovered on the sites of these Indian residential schools in Canada. Well, I grew up in Canada and I knew very little about this. Despite having covered all of these conflicts, I had never turned my lens on my own country and the horrors it perpetrated against its First Peoples. And so I was pretty blown away by the news. And the first thing I did was text Julian and asked him if he wanted to work on something together. he said he'd get back to me, and he would think about it. And in the meantime, I went looking for a nation that said they were going to do a search. It seemed natural to me to follow a search from its inception. These searches were just starting across Canada. And so I found an article in the Williams Lake Tribune about Chief Willie Sellers in the Williams Lake First Nation. And I reached out to the chief that same day, and he called me back and he said, the creator has always had great timing. Just yesterday, our council said we need someone to document this search. So I got my gear together. I talked to council on Zoom. And then, I had my gear together and was ready to go. And that's when Julian called me back. And he asked me, if I still wanted to work with him. I said, of course. And he said, all right, I'm really interested. And I said, that's great. I'm following a search at this school called St. Joseph's Mission near Williams Lake, British Columbia. And he went silent. And he said, that's crazy. That's the school my family attended and where my father was born, and that's all I've ever known. So out of 139 schools in Canada, I happened to choose the one school that Julian's family attended and where his father's life began.
Wow. And his father, Ed Archie Noisecat, who happens to also be a brilliant artist, there's this moment where Julian confronts his dad about abandoning him and really their troubled relationship. And then he sort of learns the backstory, which is incredible, that of all the things that his dad went through at this school. Had Julian planned to be part of this documentary, or did that just sort of unfold before your eyes?
No, we never planned for Julian to be in this story. I was really looking to him to be a creative partner, his deep knowledge of this world, his incredible talents in narrative, nonfiction storytelling. And in fact, even though he had this tremendous connection to the school, I was very wary of the idea of him being a participant, because I knew how hard that would be to take that on. And he was also kind of terrified of what it could do to his family, of the implications that it could have on his life. And so we forged ahead for nearly a year, not touching his story. There was one thing, though, that happened in the first 2 weeks, which was that another participant in the film, Charlene Bellew, who's actually Julian's aunt and happens to be the investigator leading the search at St. Joseph's Mission, asked us to meet her in the barns. And when we did that, she started performing a ceremony on Julian that essentially called on him to help tell the story. And so she sort of planted the seeds, and eventually the bravery of our other participants, the circumstances that seemed to keep telling him that his story and all of this mattered. He eventually decided that he was ready to take that leap, and we, were there for him and ready to follow that with him and his dad. One other thing is that he moved in with his dad during the making of the film. And so their relationship progressed to a point where both of them felt ready to take this journey together.
And can you just give people who aren't familiar, a little bit of a backstory of like, what are these schools that were opened? Why were these kids there and being principled and run by the Catholic Church?
So for over 150 years in both the United States and Canada, Indigenous children were removed from their homes in a program of forced assimilation, and they were brought to these boarding schools. There were 417 federally funded schools in the United States, and there were 139 of these in Canada. In the words of the architect of the US system, the idea was to, quote, kill the Indian, save the man. In Canada, the architect of that system, which was based on the US system, was to get rid of the Indian problem. So that was the basis of the system. And what they would do is they would take kids from their homes, and they'd bring them to these schools. They'd cut off their hair. They wouldn't be allowed to speak their language. And they'd force on them not only a program of often Christian values and learnings. Particularly the Catholic Church ran the majority of the schools in Canada, but also systematically abused them, forced them into labor, and sexually abused them. And as our film breaks news for the first time, there was a system at this particular school, and of course we don't know fully what happened at the others, of babies who were born at the school being put into the school's incinerator.
And Ed Archie Noisecat is the only infant known to survive that incinerator. And you find articles about that. So that was sort of was that the most shocking moment for you of this process?
I think we set out on a search to try to understand, if there might be graves in the ground of students who died at the school. We know students died at these schools of whether it was disease, malnourishment, starvation, suicide, running away and freezing to death, drownings. But it turned out that the story wasn't really about how many bodies there might be in the ground, but what was going on within the school itself and what might have happened to babies who were born there. We know that priests abused girls. Those girls gave birth to children. Some of those children were adopted out into white families, and some of them were put in the school's incinerator, and that's where Julian's father was found. And that was a shocking revelation that really, lined up with what was discovered in Charlene's investigation, what was also being discovered in Julian and his father's own sort of personal investigation. And that was a huge shift for us in what we thought the story was.
And there was another person that was followed who had a DNA test, and he's like, why am I Irish? Who are all these Irish people being linked to me? And he found out that his mother was raped by the Irish priest. So how did these people, how difficult was it for these people to agree to be in this film? And then how did you decide ultimately who you wanted to show?
Well, to be honest, my first day in Williams Lake, Julian joined me a few days later. I walked into a room to meet with the chief, Willie, and in the room was Willie and Rick and Charlene and a few others. And Willie, Rick, and Charlene, if you have seen the film, are the three protagonists besides Julian. And it was just so obvious. They represented such key parts of what this community was going through and how they were surviving. So Charlene, as this intrepid investigator, she's been doing this work for over 30 years, trying to get accountability. Willie, the chief, trying to keep his community alive as the death toll from St. Joseph's Mission continues to climb. These are communities with the highest rates of suicide and overdose. The repercussions of these schools, cycles of abuse continue to just have an awful impact on Indigenous families and communities. And then Rick, who was struggling with his Catholicism, his faith, and also had this secret that was in his very own DNA, which is that his father was the principal of the school, a priest. He raped his mother, and that's how Rick was born. And for his whole life, he felt like a black sheep, not really fitting fully into the Indigenous community, into the Sugarcane reservation because of his whiteness, and also at the same time not feeling like he fit in with the white community, and also still believing in the Catholic faith and looking for some truth within that. And so he goes on this epic journey all the way to the Vatican to find out, well, first of all, if the Pope will apologize, but second, looking for sort of a piece of himself there.
And Emily, it's really a fantastic, eye-opening piece of work. And I encourage everyone to go see Sugarcane. And thank you so much for being part of Gold Derby's film documentary panel.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome to Gold Derby's film documentary panel. I'm Gold Derby senior editor Denton Davidson, here with Frida director Carla Gutierrez. I am Celine Dion director Irene Taylor, and Sugarcane co-director Emily Kassie. Thank you all for being here today, and congratulations on such great films. And I'm looking at a panel made up of 3 female directors, and this wasn't something we set out to do purposely, but it just so happens that 3 of the best documentaries are by women this year. And I'm curious to ask you, do you feel like documentary as a genre is more welcoming to female directors, or is it just a different pathway in? Because it's unusual for us to have 3 female documentaries on a panel. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that. And maybe I'll start with Carla.
I think just the nature of documentaries, the history of documentaries, there's always been more space for people that just like, just do their own thing and make things happen. It's not so much, getting access from the powers that are, up there, like with fiction. So I think it attracts a lot of female producers and directors that just start a film, even if they don't have funding at some point. So yeah, I mean, I think, and me starting a career in editor, there was definitely, as an editor, there were definitely more access points as a woman. I would have to say that I don't think the industry, the community is still, very accessible and welcoming to BIPOC producers and directors. I've seen a lot less of that in my long career as an editor. But yeah, I mean, I think that it is a space where you see a lot more women as producers and directors.
And Irene, you've been in this business nearly 2 decades now. Has it felt like things have shifted for you in the past 15 to 20 years?
Well, there's certainly been shifts. I've tried to keep my head down, to be honest. I don't think about my womanness necessarily as informing my filmmaking. I just think of my humanity as informing my filmmaking. I also find I start tripping over words if I speak as a woman. But certainly in this film with Celine, I think it's undeniable a certain relatability that we both had. We are within just a few years of each other in terms of our age. We both have 3 sons. We just had these little things in common, but they ran pretty deep. And in making my previous films, I was filmmaker slash daughter, filmmaker slash mother. I've made very personal films about my family, and I also think sometimes gender can play a role in your subject's willingness to talk to you. And I don't mean to say as a woman it was easier to talk to me, but I think sometimes it is helpful if sometimes there's a gender difference between, I think about a film I made recently about survivors of childhood sexual abuse in the Boy Scouts called Leave No Trace. And a couple of the men in that film specifically pulled me aside to say, I felt like I could talk to you because I feel some anxiety around sharing such embarrassing aspects of myself. And I thought that was really interesting because, of course, I don't know what it's like to be a man who's listening, but I'm grateful that I am a woman, but I think it's really my humanity and the specific connection with each subject of each film that really is what makes the difference.
And Emily, how about for you? Was it a natural transition for you to go from investigative journalism into documentaries? Was it just a natural passion that you followed?
Yeah, I made docs in the context of newsrooms. So there were parameters to what you could do artistically, but in terms of using visual storytelling to bring to life, real stories and news events from a kind of human perspective was what I was doing. So the biggest difference was the size of the task. Usually in visual journalism and in short documentary in newsrooms, you have, maybe a month max, maybe a few months. In this film, we gave ourselves, because no one was paying us, but we gave ourselves 3 years to make something, and to be able to live in a community for 3 years, you get to a level of depth and connection and trust that you couldn't possibly access by dropping in for a shorter period of time. And I also think when the parameters of journalism are removed and you can make art and you can think about poetry and lyricism and visual language and rhythm and pacing, it transforms the work, and you're able to create cinema. And I think that cinema has a very unique power to access us on a deep emotional level that can actually change our minds much more than informational pieces can. So I think that was kind of the biggest thing for me. And I think also the collaborative nature of feature filmmaking. Like you in the newsroom, sometimes you have to be a one person show. You have to shoot and edit and all of these things. And in this case, I got to work with not only Julian, my directing partner, but I had a producing partner in Kellen Quinn. I had a shooting partner in Christopher Lamarca. We had two amazing editors in Maya Daisy Hawk and Nathan Panwar. We had so many people who touched this film who brought their extraordinary talents that made it so much better. And I just want to say to Irene's point, I do agree that, you know, we operate from a place of, you know, as filmmakers, as human beings. But I will say that it's exciting for me to get to know and be surrounded by incredible women who I so greatly admire, like Irene and like Carla. Carla can attest to the fact that I rigorously pursued her for years of wanting to work with her. And, you know, there are so many women who have led the way in this industry, and it's really incredible to be amongst them.
I just want to add that, you know, there is that relationship that we have with our subjects, what attracts us to the stories that we want to tell, and also the richness of our perspective and how we bring that into the story. There is also the aspect of, you know, of the industry, and it is true that there's still, you know, there's still problems with access in terms of like who's getting most of the funding to be able to make this, you know, these films, and you know, and maybe not as much as maybe with fiction in terms of our numbers, but I think that there is definitely, you know, a glass ceiling that is cracked, but it needs to be completely, you know, taken away. So yeah.
I'm curious to hear from each of you. Is there a documentary that you just love that feels like the gold standard in some way? Like something that you either grew up and fell in love with, or you've seen recently that is just an exceptional piece of documentary filmmaking that you look up to this day? Irene, how about you? Is there a documentary or even a filmmaker that really inspired you?
You know, the first thing that came to my mind when you said that was not a film, but it was it's an approach that I learned from the so-called godfathers of cinema verite in the early 60s. Once we had the advent of sync sound, you really saw a lot of these combination filmmakers where the director would often run sound and the DP, of course, would be running the camera. And that is how Nick Midwig and I made this film. And I think rather than looking towards another film that we were trying to emulate, we were really trying to find that dance between director and director of photography. Because with Celine, we really didn't want to outnumber her. And already 2-to-1 is outnumbering someone. And we were in such quiet spaces with her for a year that, I mean, truly quiet spaces, that we did not want to have any excess. So I really think that the way we approach our subjects with a camera, whatever we can do to just make it feel like we're all here, we all have a role, you know, the subject is her own role, right? And so that has really been my guiding light with this film, was really I would run sound, and I was that much more dialed in to the tonality of what I heard in her voice. And so that's really what I was thinking about more than film titles or other people. And like I said, I'd never made a film about a celebrity before. So I really went out of my way not to watch celebrity films, because I just didn't want to feel it at all. I wanted to just operate from a real gut place.
And Emily, how about you? Is there one film or filmmaker that you really looked up to?
There are so many. I want to point to just a a couple. I think that I was really inspired by Julia Reichardt, who did this film called Growing Up Female. And it is a film that she made almost 40 years ago at a time that was kind of unprecedented, where she followed women of different races and classes in America, and was inside their homes, was interviewing their husbands. And this was a time where women didn't have a lot of options in terms of where they could work and what they could do. And I just think that she was a trailblazer. And that was so deeply inspiring to me. I think there are incredible investigative filmmakers like Laura Poitras, who is again bringing together, cinema and hard kind of journalism and truth telling. But I also want to point to, in terms of Sugarcane, that I had a pretty massive education in Indigenous storytelling and cinema and art. And Julian and I spent a lot of time watching, Powwow Highway or Smoke Signals, or Taika Waititi's films like Boy and Hunt for the Wilder People. And that, I just think for every film, there's kind of an incredible arsenal of work that has been done that we, in particular with this film, wanted to be in conversation with, and think really thoughtfully about how we could be in conversation with Indigenous filmmakers, and also be in refutation of the colonial legacy of documentary. Arguably the first documentary was Nanook of the North, which was about, the Inuit people up in Canada, and was a kind of racist and very kind of patronizing portrayal of them. And it was so important to us that the way we approached this film was a refutation of that, and that really required understanding the artists and voices that we were, adding this film to their legacy.
And Carla, how about you?
Gosh, I think that I'm very much inspired by good filmmaking, good storytelling. I mean, I think something that Emily mentioned is the power of film to really show kind of like the world through the eyes of somebody very specific. And there is so much responsibility that we have for our characters, our stories. But at the same time, I think that, getting really, very, very intimate, and also like just choosing what we want to focus on, we're never going to present, the entire life of somebody. We're never going to present, a character's like whole being. We're making choices in terms of what we want to tell with this film, what we want to focus on. With Frida, it was very much this, a sense of like expressing your true, honest voice, even if it's complicated, even if it's, it's just, even if you're difficult, and the complexities of that experience and your emotions, that's cathartic. That's a good thing. That was the theme that we were going for in Frida, especially for women and non-binary people. So I'm always looking for, for films that inspire, that good storytelling that can be told in so many different ways. I mean, for Frida specifically, I was very much inspired by Sena, by Asit Kapadia, because it really brought to life, a different time through archival footage, but that was always seen through a very, very personal, perspective. And you felt that you were like, kind of like living through that time at that moment, that it felt very, very present, very of the moment. And we were dealing with Frida, with a story that happened in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s in Mexico. But I wanted the audience to really feel as if we were just seeing her be alive, like really, really capture her spirit and feel her spirit, like be very, very present, as if you were listening from her right now as a friend, right? But I mean, there are films like, I was lucky enough to be able to work on this film with David Teague, who edited Cutie and the Boxer, and that's, a film that just through verite and just the way that the film like feels the layers of people, and the complexity of like this intimate experience of a couple. It's just like a beautiful, tall story. So, or The Thin Blue Line, for example, which like really uses, interviews in an amazing way. So for me, it's just kind of like central to be inspired by watching a lot of documentaries all the time. But also, just having a good sense of what the theme of the film is. What do you want to say? And then in a way, style, approach, and format kind of like has to lift that up and not be the center. Like I don't believe that you should start with style. You should start with like what is the heart of the story that you want to tell, and then everything else needs to support that. So I'm always looking at good storytelling in films to give me inspiration of how to do that.
I think so often when we, are calling upon other films we may have seen, it's like calling on your ancestors. You're sort of reaching back to try to duplicate or replicate that emotion you felt. And I know when I was making this film about Celine, I was so surprised by her every day. Every day I was with her, she surprised me. And so I wanted to bring that element in, but I also just wanted to make sure that I had all of these elegant variables that I knew were fitting with who she was. And I wasn't trying to compete with her music because I wasn't really even a fan of her music, but I was trying to find a score, for example, and I tried to think of previous scores that I've heard because I was just constantly trying to put my audience in an emotional spot, and back to the women conversation. I mean, we are all women here talking with you today, but I don't think we're more emotional. But I know that with my female colleagues and female friends, I can talk about those things with abandon and not feel like they're womanly or embarrassing. It's like, I think, what Carla just said, like starting with this intuitive, emotional place, is very compelling, and I think, what is so powerful about Emily's story is that there's so much emotion tied up in it that is, of course, historic. It is diabolically evil, and yet you're trying to find something that makes it watchable so that you want to stay with the story, and that really is the power of good characters, people who make you want to like hang on. And I think all of our films are like very different in so many ways, but I think they're all really driven by, I feel like, the intuition of the directors in them.
And they're all inspiring the next generation as well. And I want to thank all of you for joining our documentary film panel today. And remind everyone watching, if you haven't yet, see Frida by Carla Gutierrez, I Am Celine Dion by Irene Taylor, and Sugarcane by Emily Kassie and Julian Brave Noise Cat. Really incredible films, and best to all of you this upcoming awards season.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.